Salomé's Dance of the Seven Veils might be a catalyst that leads to the death of both protagonists in Wilde's play, Salomé doesn't actually die dancing. But Wilde's version of Salomé was only one of many in circulation at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. And many of the alternative versions, often embodied by dancers in musical theatres, featured Salomé's dance as the culmination of her story, rather than the perverse necrophilic appetites assigned to her by Wilde. Indeed, as an iconic story of a dancer during the period that saw the birth of modern dance, more often than not, Salomé actually danced again with John the Baptist's dismembered head on the silver platter. And indeed, the whole final section from the Dance of the Seven Veils onwards gained importance due to a certain squeamishness with the ending of the play and Strauss's opera. Recognition of Salomé's pathology in the Freudian era could not deter a culturally Christian audience and critical press obsessed with the Wagnerian conception of redemption from reading Salomé's death as her Liebestod, or should I say transfiguration. This impression was compounded by music. Salomé's death, allied to the traditional operatic narrative and musical closure, could only lead to such an interpretation, for any alternative was too monstrous to behold. Moreover, the first Salomé in Strauss's opera, Marie Wittich, was a well-known Isolde, who at the same time as rehearsing Salomé was preparing for a performance of Tristan in Bayreuth. Thus, the press were unable to escape reading Salomé's death in terms of Isolde's transfiguration. Very few critics were willing to recognise not only an inversion of Wagnerian ideology, that is, Strauss positing Salomé as an extreme physicalisation of Isolde's metaphysical love, but also Strauss's calculated affront on music drama, as the title character seduces the Redeemer, who is not redeemed, but beheaded. But let's get back to dance, and specifically to Paris, the only city in which Wilde's play was publicly performed in the 19th century. Wilde's stage directions for the dance are infamously laconic, simply specifying Salomé dances the Dance of the Seven Veils. And the lost music by the young chansonnier René Darley, to which the actress Lina Mant actually danced in 1896, was described by very few. One rather iconic society journalist describing a music, and I quote, of curious rhythm, with an original melody played on an out-of-tune piano and a flute which ignored the pulse. No more is known of the music to which the first embodied Wildean Salomé danced. Biblical sources from the Gospels of St. Matthew and Mark give no detail of the dance, which over the centuries has been left to the imagination of artists, writers and dancers. The most influential precedent for Wilde's drama was no doubt Gustave Flaubert's Hérodias, one of his Trois Contes, published in 1877. But Flaubert's description was as much about the gaze of the audience and the sensations the dance provoked in them, as the highly supple young woman who could bend from the hips, sweep her chin to the floor, and walk swiftly on her hands, the nape of her neck and her vertebrae at right angles to one another. Joris Karl Huysmans' Arabour contained a graphically decadent and sensual description of Salomé dancing, which was greatly influenced by Gustave Moreau's famous paintings, L'Apparition and Salomé dansant devant Hérode. But literary and artistic renderings of Salomé are not embodied performances, and the tensions between the symbolism of the text and the actor's gestures on the one hand, and the extreme realism at certain points of the drama, such as the dance and all the action with the dismembered head, are very hard to reconcile in performance. Nevertheless, the craze for the live performance of Salomé in Paris, or Salomania as it has become known, started well ahead of Wilde's play, which can be seen as an influential part of an artistic and aesthetic trend, but in no way the sole source of the interpretation of Salomé by dancers from the 1880s onwards, who were accessing a whole range of balletic techniques and cultural and artistic signifiers in the creation of their spectacles. While there is a host of performances I could discuss today, I have chosen to focus on one Parisian dancer who modulated her Salomé performances to 3 different high art scores between 1907 and 1912, and that is Natalia Trouhanowa. The Russian Natalia Trouhanowa was a strong actress and character dancer, as well as a master of stagecraft with great entrepreneurial spirit and artistic endeavour, in step with the aesthetic concerns of her era. She was allied to the post-naturalist movement, which strove to create synthetic theatrical experience also. She debunked romantic balletic technique and advocated a renewal of dance through modern choreographic gesture. Moreover, according to Richard Strauss, she was a complete pain to work with. Trouhanowa was booked to dance the Seven Veils for the Czech soprano Emmy Destin during the Parisian premiere of Strauss's opera in May 1907. Trouhanowa reported in the press, and I quote, "I came to take a curtain call. Strauss stopped me, and preventing me from going on stage. He said it was his place to take a bow, for dance was but an inferior art." On the other hand, Romain Rolland recounted how Strauss, and I quote, "is charmed by all the French, except by Mademoiselle Trouhanowa, and he drinks to all the French, except Mademoiselle Trouhanowa." And yet ballet was still seen as a minor art, and only with the 1910 performances of the Ballet Russe did ballet really come of age in the modern era, revealing the intrinsic value of modern dance. Indeed, Trouhanowa also had a very difficult working relationship with Serge Diaghilev, which left her on the margins of the Ballet Russe troupe. But with her own connections, talents and determination, she managed to forge a career in the Parisian milieu. With regard to Strauss, Trouhanowa seems to have reported to the press the most horrific insult she could muster, for her own beliefs in the power of dance to communicate powerful emotions, and ones at least as powerful as music and opera, were unequivocal. And yet, with regard to Salomé, Trouhanowa did not seem overly concerned with the Parisian production, apart from ensuring that her costumes were an exact replica of those worn by Emmy Destin. For she expected to arrive from Monte Carlo, where she was paid by the day, 2 days before the dress rehearsal, step into the role, and dance the 9 minutes of Strauss's music as she saw fit. The press tells us very little about what she did on stage, many describing Trouhanowa as cautiously voluptuous and languorous, although one critic was struck by a kneeling Trouhanowa who leant backwards, touching the nape of her neck to the ground. Whatever she did do, however, was seen as relatively chaste in comparison to the more lascivious and shocking performances given by Maud Allen at the Théâtre des Variétés the previous evening. I don't know if you can see that. Yes, you can, just about. This is just a short table to show you some of the different Salomé performances, the well-known ones to high art scores in the period that I'm talking about. So 3 years later, in April and May 1910, both Strauss's Salomé in French translation and the opera Salomé by Frenchman Antoine Mariotte were given in Paris within a fortnight of each other. And Trouhanowa was once again back on the scene, dancing for the singer Lucienne Béréval in the performances of Mariotte's opera. At the Opéra, Mary Garden had been cast as Strauss's Salomé. She chose to dance herself, and while some critics were scathing of her melodramatic gesticulation and constant movement, they still conceded that her composition of the character was remarkable and exemplary. To ensure the critical success of Mariotte's opera, the doyenne of the opera stage, Lucienne Béréval, had been cast as Salomé. At 40, Béréval should have been at the height of her art, but press reports suggest a consummate but rather stately actress with a voice of already declining brilliance. 15 years her junior, Natalia Trouhanowa was thus cast to interpret the Dance of the Seven Veils, the dancer seizing the opportunity to deploy her Salomé box of tricks, and apparently succeeding in taking erotic voyeurism of the audience to a new level. Wearing as little as possible, Trouhanowa was considered opulent, lascivious, and infinitely troubling. Many critics evoked or even cited Flaubert's highly charged description of Salomé's dance from Hérodias in order to avoid relating their own erotic experiences. But Trouhanowa came into her own in April 1912 with the mounting of a dance spectacle in association with Jacques Rouchet, comprising 4 symphonic works: Istar by Vincent d'Indy, La Tragédie de Salomé by Florent Schmitt, Adélaïde ou le langage des fleurs, which was an orchestration of Les Valses Nobles et Sentimentales by Maurice Ravel, and La Péri by Paul Dukas. Each work was given in a different set, designed and painted by a different reputed French designer. Each composer conducted his own work at the head of the Orchestre Lamoureux. By rejuvenating ballet through the use of evocative French symphonic music and the talents of French stage designers, Trouhanowa was seen to achieve a perfection of collaboration between the arts. This evening of art dance then contained another Salomé, one originally conceived for Louis Fuller by Robert Dumière and Florent Schmitt in November 1907. Thus, in the wake of Strauss's Salomé in Paris, Fuller luxuriously mounted the fashionably aestheticized Orientalist extravaganza, La Tragédie de Salomé. In 1910, Schmidt's music, originally scored for a pit band of 20 musicians and lasting an hour, was reworked into a symphonic poem for full orchestra lasting less than half an hour. The symphonic poem's vivid imagery and the lure of Salomé for modern dancers meant, however, that the score was swiftly transposed back to the theatre, Trouhanowa being the first of the Russians to perform La Tragédie de Salomé. But Humier wrote a narrative scenario, not a play, which differed to Wilde's version. It was written in a heady, decadent style, but it dismissed much of the sophisticated symbolism of Wilde's text, particularly the reflexive obsession with the gaze and thus representation, presenting a more straightforward but perhaps post-Freudian interpretation of the classic story. Like Maud Allen's rather convoluted double narrative in her vision of Salomé, which saw Salomé relive the preceding biblical events in a hallucinatory sequence where she dances again and John the Baptist's head appears before her, the focus here is on Salomé's dance and her confused sensations of lust and fear that provoke some sort of seizure as the curtain falls. Again, we don't actually know how she does. Of particular importance are the differences in Humier's scenario from the Dance of the Seven Veils onwards. The lightning dance, as it's called here, forms the start of the final section and is seen only in flashes of lightning as Salomé dances and an aroused Herod rips off her veils. Salomé thus appears momentarily nude in silhouette before an onstage John the Baptist comes out of the shadows to cover her with his cowl. Indeed, this is no dance of seduction, but one full of menace, terror, and frustration, which leaves Herod furious, and Herodias, interpreting Herod's gestures, gives the signal for John's execution. Salomé is presented with the Baptist's head on a platter and dances, before casting the platter over the parapet into the Dead Sea, which begins to smoke on contact with the precursor's blood. Half unconscious, Salomé falls against the abandoned throne before seeing John's head on the parapet. She cannot meet the gaze and turns her head away. Multiple heads then appear at different points of the stage, as if Salomé's deranged mind was hallucinating, before she completely loses her senses in a frenzied final dance of terror. Herod does not order the murder of his stepdaughter, but the sky turns blood red, a storm descends, trees are uprooted, and architectural stones displaced in a grandiose, apocalyptic, and moralizing finale. Trouhanowa collaborated with Schmidt and Humier to create a consummate spectacle, and many of her preparatory papers and letters to various collaborators are conserved in Parisian archives. Thus, some attempt at a genetic analysis of her performance can be made, examination of Trouhanowa's creative choices, allowing us a better understanding of her own aesthetic beliefs and statements. She paid great attention to costumes, scenography, lighting, and scenery, desiring a lightweight solution suitable for a touring production. But she was especially concerned with the mimetic aspects of her dance and their correspondence to the published libretto in order to keep her public enthralled. The last section of La Tragédie de Salomé, comprising the lightning dance, effectively the Dance of the Seven Veils, and the Dance of Terror, is therefore the most revealing of Trouhanowa's artistry. In Wild Salomé, as Herod orders Salomé's murder, the slaves put out the torches and the stars and the moon disappear, but only after Salomé has kissed the dismembered head of John the Baptist. In the scenario for La Tragédie de Salomé, the kiss does not exist. That was Lucien Réval. Nevertheless, Trouhanowa wished to stage the kissing of the head whilst occulting it from full view. She first covered the head with one of her discarded veils before kissing it, then lifted it over her head and cast it spectacularly and ritualistically into the sea. I quote, "It will be almost hieratic, religious, I don't know how to describe it. A little like the way we cover the symbols of Christ's body in the Orthodox religion." Thus, in a similar way to decadent literature, Trouhanowa appropriated religious symbolism and ritual, but jettisoned Christian morality. The covered head rendered the kiss less explicit, less fleshy, but its veil, Salomé's veil, heightened a certain rather traditional, Orientalist eroticism. The result of the Dance of the Seven Veils, seen only intermittently through flashes of lightning, however, intensifies the objectivity of the dancer. The lighting creating fixed, stylized poses of certain actions, tableaus, snapshots, silhouettes of the progress of Salomé's dance are presented for the in-house audience in a similar way to the gestures described by Strauss in his 1922 prescription of how he thought the dance should be performed in his opera. But in Lumiere's scenario, the head has its revenge by coming back to haunt Salomé, fixing her once again as the subject of the male, yet now disembodied gaze. Yet the appearance of the multiple heads was abhorrent to Trouhanowa, and she wrote, "Whatever we do with the head will be idiotic, dead, amateurish or ridiculous, such as projections, wax heads, etc." Thus, she wished to translate Salomé's hallucination purely through expressive mind action. She preferred also to repeat the opening dramatic motive, as she called it, of John slowly crossing the stage, this time trailing one of Salomé's veils, presumably the one through which he kissed his head. She believed both actions would better render Salomé's true fear and despair, for they would symbolise the indestructible and the immortal. As with her analogy to the body and blood of Christ, Trouhanowa equated John the Baptist with his cousin, first choosing to cover his head, and then to resurrect a whole John who does not gaze on anyone, but rather passes through as a mystical symbol of time immemorial, or even as a Christian symbol of eternal life. In this way, Trouhanowa establishes a grandiose narrative frame, one might say a patriarchal frame, yet subverted the notion of the Baptist gaze and Salomé's objectivity. Lumiere's Salomé is not killed by male actors, but patriarchal order is still enforced in other ways. Rather than have the palace collapse in the final storm, which Trouhanowa qualified as Samsonesque, she preferred to have a cypress tree uprooted and fall across the terrace as a symbol of the insurmountable, and which would provoke Salomé's final attack. Thus, Trouhanowa internalized, subjectified drama acted out through gesture, allied with the forces of nature, would provoke, and I quote Trouhanowa again, the hystero-epilepto desperate fury, which would make her collapse in an infernal delirium. So whilst Trouhanowa managed to detract attention away from the gaze of the Baptist on Salomé, she rather neatly slipped into the position in modern realist theatre of that very Parisian hysteric to be gazed upon by all and sundry. But what does Schmidt's score have to say? The lightning dance is a frenzied, and this is where you have a handout with some score pages on it, and hopefully we'll have time to just listen to a minute of it. The lightning dance is a frenzied, heaving battle of wills between Herod and Salomé, that with its jerky rhythms, and you can see there are alternating 2 bars of 3.5, 4, with sections in 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, and 3/8. Those jerky rhythms lose all sense of seduction and that traditionally characterises the Dance of the Seven Veils. The Dance of Terror Peroration is a tense mixture of static anticipatory passages followed by a vivid, surging, howling storm. Schmidt's musical treatment, his techniques, all redolent of Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, portray an atmosphere of exotic violence and frenzy, terror, passion, and animalistic arousal in these last 2 dances. Despite the score's seeming attraction for dancers, the final storm and hallucination were obviously difficult to render in dance. The critic Jacques Pillois wrote evocatively of the final dances, but chided Trouhanowa for movements to Schmidt's score that were not synchronized with the duration, intensity, and cohesion of the music, believing Schmidt's subtle rhythms to remain dead on stage. Moreover, he condemned the mime action accompanying the music, which, and I quote, does not manage to translate in gestures of an equal expressive strength, which does not follow the hallucinatory progression, which lessens or betrays the rare vigour of the music. Thus, despite all Trouhanowa's efforts and concerns for the mimetic relationship between music and dance, it seems that the results did not always evoke a comforting consensus of opinion. Trouhanowa had previously expressed her opinions on the aesthetic bankruptcy of conventional balletic technique, and 4 days before the premiere of her 1912 Concert de Danse, she gave a press interview where she voiced her belief in modern dance, which, free from worn-out balletic convention, could replace the human voice as a communicator of powerful emotions. Thus, all Trouhanowa's Salomés danced to symphonically conceived music by Strauss, Marriott, or Schmidt were meant to be as expressive as their sung counterparts, In possession of a voice, Trouhanowa could slip more easily into the active subject position than the dancer who traditionally only existed in the visual realm. All Trouhanowa's artistic choices attest to this in La Tragédie de Salomé, for apart from her final appearance as a Charcotesque hysteric, she constantly tried to shift her Salomé from the object to the subject position, and through expressive balletic movement to produce a voice which might participate in the music drama. Despite collaborating with choreographers, dancers such as Trouhanowa and Ida Rubinstein, who of course also famously danced for Wild Salomé with music by Alexander Glazunov, but that's a completely other story which I haven't got time to talk about today. But both dancers carefully scripted their narratives of their productions, experimenting with the multivarious forms and striking diversity, as composers, designers, choreographers and interpreters were drawn into a defining search for the ultimate theatrical experience in the modernist era. In this context, Natalia Trouhanowa moved from opera to the ballet stage, modulating her performance of Salomé, and constantly refined and affirmed her dynamic and individual aesthetic vision and artistic personality. She died Salomé's horrific death 1,000 times, but she always lived to tell the tale.